Will AI replace physicians in the near future? All right, let me break it down. Hey, my name is James Charpentier, and welcome to Less Than 3%, where we talk about healthcare, my journey to become a physician, and really anything from the perspective of a black man pursuing medicine. And in this episode, I got something that I think is pretty interesting. So, just to kind of get into it, give a little context, there's been a lot of conversation when it comes to this whole thing of AI, when it comes to artificial intelligence. It's something that is definitely starting to take the world by storm, whether it's through business or integrating into maybe education or something like that. But in this episode, being that, of course, one of the main themes of this podcast is healthcare, I want to really tie this into something I found very, very interesting. There's even a conversation I was able to be a part of, a pretty intense, big conversation a little while back that really had me thinking about this quite a lot. And that is really, what role does AI play when it comes to healthcare and the healthcare field? Is it possible, considering that there's been a lot of conversation about AI potentially replacing people's jobs, whether it comes to business or these different fields, could it possibly be replacing the job of doctors? I mean, one thing we're learning about AI is that it's really growing, more and more, probably by the day, by the year. And so I would probably question, okay, could AI be replacing doctors in the near future? Is it capable of doing those types of jobs? Just what is it capable of? And so we're going to get pretty deep into that in this episode, so definitely stay tuned. There's quite a lot of articles that I definitely want to get into in this podcast episode, because I think there's quite a lot of things that can help give us a lot of a better perspective and a better idea of just what's going on in the world of artificial intelligence. So the first thing I want to bring up is really an article that pretty much sparked this entire topic. And I think when you see the title of it, it might grab your attention as well. So this is an article that was published by the AMA, written by Jennifer Lubell, and it's titled ChatGPT Passed the USMLE. What does it mean for MedEd? So for those who don't know, the USMLE is a very, very important exam for those who are aspiring physicians. It's an exam that's broken up into, I believe, 3 parts. So you'll have Step 1, USMLE Step 2, and USMLE Step 3. The first 2 exams are typically taken in medical school, and then Step 3 is taken later on in training. And so these are very, very big, very important exams that determine a lot of things in terms of an aspiring physician's career, what type of physician they want to become, ultimately just what residency programs they're trying to get into as they further on in training. So this is not just like a small deal. Like you think about the SAT, the ACT, I mean, those are big exams. This is also like a very big deal. So considering that it's mentioning ChatGPT, which has kind of been taking, a lot of the world by storm in terms of its growing popularity, this article by the American Medical Association is claiming this was able to pass the USMLE exam. So that's a pretty big deal. One thing I do want to point to specifically, one thing they mentioned in detail is that the technology proved that it could pass the exams at 60% accuracy without prior reinforcement or training. So these are exams that people are taking months on months to study for, and ChatGPT passed this with like no prior reinforcement or training. So that's pretty serious. Now, with that being said, not just getting into the medical training, but how about the actual medical practice? I mean, I think one of the key questions that I'd want us to really get the answer to here would just be, what jobs could it replace? What doctors in particular could be affected? Is it all doctors, or could it be certain doctors? And one of the things I've noticed has been talked about when it comes to AI is radiology. Radiology is a field where there's a lot of imaging. There's a lot of just reading scans and trying to interpret different things. And computer artificial intelligence, is able to potentially do things like that. So I want to take a look at a paper that goes into this a little bit specifically. It's published in the Radiological Society of North America, or the RSNA. And what they talk about in this article, it's titled AI Accurately Identifies Normal and Abnormal Chest X-rays. So one thing it's mentioning is that AI has been able to identify, part of the radiologist's bread and butter, which is looking at x-ray scans. So they specifically looked at chest x-rays from emergency departments in both in-hospital and outpatient settings. And what happened is that the x-rays were classified by the AI tool as either high confidence normal or not high confidence normal, which would basically just sort the x-rays into normal and abnormal. So, I mean, with that being said, we're seeing really the potential of AI in terms of being able to do jobs that physicians do. I mean, these are things that are part of some physicians' bread and butter. And it really just goes back to the concern that a lot of people brought up of like AI potentially going to be replacing people's jobs and taking people's jobs away. And one paper that I want to look at, written by Max Zahn and ABC News, that basically just titles what I think a lot of news headlines have been about: is AI coming for your job? ChatGPT renews fears. And one of the things they highlight is this restaurant, specifically called Sergio's, which is a Cuban restaurant in Miami, where the owner of this restaurant is actually using artificial intelligence as waiters. It mentions that the extra help of this AI serving this position was able to cut wait staff by as much as 20%. And on top of that, these robots are only costing about $2 per hour. So just putting that into perspective, it makes a little bit of sense how someone would be concerned about, hey, can AI do some of these different tasks and ultimately take jobs away from other people? I mean, what are the different perspectives on this? Like, how are people connected to the healthcare system actually looking at this issue? And I ran across an article published in Omnia Health that's titled 3 Reasons AI is Not Ready to Replace Radiologists. So if we just take a look at this, there's a couple factors they bring up that basically highlight how AI isn't necessarily the sort of terror that a lot of us maybe think about it as, at least as of right now. One they mention is, for instance, radiology is a multifaceted job. So it's not just sitting there in a reading room and just reading something. But along with that, they're connecting the findings that they're getting from that imaging data to test results and patient data, and ultimately being able to determine what they need to determine for that specific patient. Another thing they actually mentioned is that AI's accuracy is a little bit of a problem when it comes to this issue, actually. And one study they cite from the British Medical Journal states that when looking at a FRCR exam, also known as the Fellowship of Royal College of Radiologists exam, which is an exam that, of course, is not easy, where according to this article, candidates have to analyze and interpret 30 radiographs in just 35 minutes. They found out the AI candidate was only able to pass like 2 out of the 10 mock exams that it took. So there are definitely a couple things to consider. It mentions AI's accuracy is still a challenge, that its development might be a little bit slower when compared to other industries. But one thing I would definitely say, and one thing that really came up in the conversation I was able to have, was although AI maybe can't just replace doctors right now and be able to do certain jobs, there's still a lot of limitations it has. What's necessarily stopping it from growing to that point in the future? Could it be that maybe in the near future it's not as big of an issue, but in the more distant future, it could really be out here replacing people's jobs? That could probably be the scary part. What is it that physicians can do that AI can't potentially do in the future? What is it that's stopping AI from being able to do a lot of the tasks that we do when it comes to diagnostics? I believe you can already look for certain apps. They're able to help diagnose you or look at different health conditions just based off of information you feed it, or off of maybe a scan or something like that. So, I mean, AI is already kind of going to that point. What's stopping it from being at the level of really just taking away physicians' jobs? One of the things that came up in the conversation I was able to be part of was maybe certain more procedural specialties not being affected as much, and specialties where maybe there's a lot more reading involved, or it's not as much things that are more dependent on human judgment that's involved. I mean, those jobs could potentially really be at risk. And another factor to consider as well is, for instance, one of the major themes that's come up in this podcast has had to do with health disparities, and how, even just for example, with one of the major themes of this podcast, the fact that even Black males such as myself only make up less than 3% of all physicians in the healthcare field, or the fact that, as we talked about in a pretty recent episode, the potential physician shortages that are going on, and how we could be looking at huge shortages, not just in physicians altogether, but especially primary care. If we just take a look at one of the articles that was brought up in a previous podcast, the AMC put out a statistic stating that the U.S. is expected to face a shortage of physicians ranging from about 21,400 to 55,200 just by 2033, which is really not that far away. So when we consider the disparities and some of the issues and shortages that are already here when it comes to physicians, could AI, by potentially taking away jobs, make that situation even worse? And so that's definitely an issue to consider. Now, one of the major points that really came out of the conversation I was able to have, and one of the things that I would definitely present on this podcast is, I would just say, ultimately, what we really have to think about is not just what's the major problem going on in front of us, but also, ultimately, how do we deal with it? What's the response? And so ultimately, the conclusion that I've really been able to come out of this with is, okay, it really comes down to using AI to our advantage. Because sure, we could think about, okay, AI might be able to take away jobs and maybe able to stop physicians from doing this and that. But okay, how could AI maybe actually make our jobs better? Because there are a lot of aspects of the healthcare field and of just practicing as a physician and a medicine that may be a little bit more difficult for people to maybe do. I don't know if maybe that's charting or just different aspects of the job that AI could actually help improve and make better. So one of the immediate conclusions that I kind of came to was, hey, I think AI actually might be able to improve certain things. When we think about the primary care physician shortage, maybe this is actually something that could really help. One of the things I remember I brought up in a previous podcast episode when it came to shortages and all these things was that one of the things that could help is more like telehealth. And so one thing I figured is AI could definitely play into helping improve that, whether that's just making the process quicker, more efficient. And for that, I went again to a specific article that I found written by Jock Putney titled How Artificial Intelligence Can Help Primary Care Doctors and Their Patients. So just looking at some of the major points that was brought up in this article, one quote that was brought up that I thought was very interesting was that AI can unlock a physician's ability to understand a patient's needs beyond their 15-minute office visit by helping that physician make sense of longitudinal data from multiple sources, such as wearables, at-home biometric technology, and Internet of Things devices. So one thing that this article is mentioning is how tying technology into this could really just make the patient's job better. A lot of physicians are really only able to see their patients for about like 15 minutes tops. And if you're able to also integrate technology and being able to monitor patients' health and things like that, if anything, that could really help contribute to better patient outcomes. And one thing I would definitely say that I really think is a huge major factor is ultimately the human aspect of healthcare. Healthcare is not just dealing with a set of numbers or dealing with certain pathologies and trying to fix this issue and that issue, but it's also caring for patients as people. It's caring for people. It's taking care of others. It's helping each other. And so I think a major aspect of this that maybe isn't getting brought up enough is that it's not just about fixing an issue, but there's a human connection that's there between a physician and patient. There's a human connection and a type of empathy that can only really come from people and not necessarily machines and robots and computers. And so one of the other conclusions I come out of this with is, hey, there's a place for physicians just as people who are able to stand and help people. And again, that really just ties back to the type of physician I'm trying to be. I could see myself really trying to use AI to make my job more efficient and better and able to help my patients more. But ultimately, it's still me that's trying to help another person get better. And so AI is not necessarily just going to take that away completely. So I think that's another aspect that as much as people can maybe adjust to computers and using AI and all these different things as part of their care, at the end of the day, they can never replace that human connection. They can never really get rid of that human aspect of healthcare. And so that's definitely a major conclusion I would have us get out of this. And so one thing I would say, maybe some of the major things you could take out of this podcast episode is that whatever issue we're talking about, whatever issue, is right in front of us, at the end of the day, it's still going to come down to how you're actually going to respond to it and how can you use it potentially to your advantage in terms of dealing with other issues. And again, one of the things I've stressed in a lot of podcast episodes is just that ultimately, in terms of being a physician, it's not just treating health conditions, but it's really helping people holistically, emotionally, mentally, and physically, all these different aspects together and not just in their own separate pockets. And so one thing I would say is even when it comes to AI, even when it comes to issues like this, at the end of the day, especially for those aspiring to become physicians, it shouldn't necessarily stop us from doing really what I would say is kind of the heart of that job of being a healthcare worker and ultimately a doctor, which is caring for people. So definitely make sure that you really take that with you in whatever part of your training, whatever part of your career that you're at, really that care that you're providing to people. And so with that really just wraps up this episode. So I hope you enjoyed this and let's see what we talk about in the next one.